A charming stranger arrived in the cotton country, and within a few years, 13 powerful men would come to learn that revenge can wear the calmest of smiles. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you appreciate powerful, untold stories from the past, please subscribe to our channel and like this video if you haven't already. We truly appreciate your support. Stay with us until the very end, because this is a story so strange and suspenseful that you won't want to miss a single paragraph. Now, relax as we begin our story. In the humid countryside of Louisiana during the year 1858, plantations stretched across the land like small kingdoms. Each one belonged to a wealthy master whose authority appeared absolute. Cotton fields rolled for miles beneath the heavy sun, and the lives of thousands were controlled by a handful of powerful men. Yet power has a strange weakness. It blinds those who believe they cannot be touched, and sometimes the quietest stranger can slip past their defenses. The stranger appeared one late afternoon along a dusty road that curved between two large estates. His clothes were simple yet clean, and his posture carried a calm confidence that made people look twice. He introduced himself as Elias Mercer. His voice was smooth, educated, and unexpectedly refined for a traveler walking alone through plantation country. No one knew exactly where he came from, but people quickly remembered his eyes, steady, observant, and strangely patient. Within days, he found work repairing instruments and clocks. Plantation houses were full of delicate machines shipped from Europe, and few people nearby understood how to fix them. Elias did. Word spread quickly that the mysterious traveler could restore broken timepieces, tune pianos, and repair intricate locks. Plantation masters welcomed him into their homes. They saw a useful craftsman. None of them realized they had just opened the doors of their private lives to a man whose intentions were far more complicated. The first plantation to invite Elias Mercer inside belonged to Harold Wickham, a man known across the parish for his wealth and temper. Wickham owned vast cotton fields and believed discipline and fear were the only tools needed to maintain control. His mansion rose above the fields like a palace, with tall white columns and long verandas designed to capture the evening breeze. When Elias arrived to repair a broken grandfather clock, he entered a world of luxury that hid darker truths beneath polished floors. Wickham barely noticed the quiet craftsman working in the corner of his study. Like many powerful men, he spoke freely in front of someone he considered invisible. Elias listened carefully while adjusting gears and springs inside the clock. He heard complaints about neighboring plantation owners. He heard discussions about debts, rivalries, and hidden resentments. Most importantly, he learned something else about Wickham and men like him. Their greatest weakness was not money or power. It was pride. While Wickham bragged about his influence, another pair of eyes quietly observed the visitor from across the room. Clara Wickham stood near the window with a book in her hands. Though she had not turned a page for several minutes, she watched the stranger with curiosity. There was something unusual about him. His calm manner seemed untouched by the tension that filled the house. When he finished repairing the clock and lifted the pendulum into place, Clara finally spoke. She thanked him for his work and asked where he had learned such precise skills. Elias answered politely but briefly. He explained that he had traveled through many towns, learning from craftsmen and scholars wherever he could. His voice carried a quiet intelligence that surprised her. In plantation society, conversations were rarely honest, yet this stranger spoke with careful sincerity. Clara did not know it yet, but that brief conversation would become the first thread in a web Elias Mercer had already begun to spin. Across the parish, several plantation households soon heard about the talented clockmaker who could fix nearly anything. Invitations followed. Elias Mercer traveled from estate to estate, welcomed by men who believed they were hiring a simple repairman. In truth, he was studying them. He observed their habits, their fears, and their weaknesses. Every plantation revealed another layer of the strange world these masters had built around themselves. Among them was Nathaniel Brick, a plantation owner whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about even by other masters. His wife, Eleanor Brick, lived almost like a prisoner within the large house. Servants rarely saw her smile. She moved quietly through long hallways lined with portraits of Brick ancestors who seemed to stare down with cold approval. When Elias arrived to repair a damaged piano in the parlor, Eleanor noticed something different about him immediately. Unlike most men who entered the plantation house, Elias did not speak loudly or demand attention. He worked with careful patience. As he tuned the piano, soft notes filled the room. Eleanor listened, surprised by how beautiful the instrument sounded under his hands. She had not heard music played with such care since her childhood. Without realizing it, she began asking him questions. Where had he learned to play? Which cities had he visited? What stories had he seen beyond the cotton fields? Their conversation lasted only minutes before Nathaniel Brick returned to the room. Yet something had already shifted. Elias Mercer left the plantation that afternoon with another quiet observation stored in his mind. The wives of these powerful men were lonely. Many lived in houses filled with luxury, but empty of kindness. And loneliness, Elias understood very well, could become the most powerful doorway into a human heart. Rumors began spreading through the parish during the year 1859. Women from several plantations mentioned the thoughtful craftsman who had repaired their instruments or clocks. They spoke about how polite he was, how intelligent his conversations seemed compared to the boastful discussions of their husbands. These remarks sounded harmless at first, yet beneath the polite compliments, something more complicated was beginning to grow. Elias Mercer moved carefully, never staying too long at one plantation. He understood that suspicion often grows from repetition. Instead, he traveled between estates like a drifting scholar. Sometimes he repaired a watch. Sometimes he tuned a piano. Other times he fixed intricate locks on jewelry boxes or writing desks. With every visit, he listened more than he spoke. His quiet attention made people comfortable. It also allowed him to gather stories no outsider was supposed to hear. The plantation wives began to trust him in ways they did not fully understand. He asked thoughtful questions about books, music, and places beyond Louisiana. Many of them had once dreamed of traveling or studying in distant cities. Marriage into wealthy plantation families had quietly closed those doors. Elias reopened them through conversation alone. A few kind words, a thoughtful observation, a shared memory of distant places. Slowly, the stranger became someone they looked forward to seeing. None of the plantation masters noticed the shift happening within their own homes. To them, Elias Mercer remained a useful repairman who understood delicate machines. They laughed loudly during dinners and business gatherings, while their wives listened quietly nearby. Pride kept the masters blind. They never imagined that a man they barely acknowledged was studying every detail of their lives with the patience of someone who had waited many years for the right moment. The truth about Elias Mercer began many years earlier, long before he stepped onto the dusty roads of Louisiana. During the year 1847, a young boy had stood beside his mother outside a plantation auction yard in Mississippi. The boy watched strangers examine people as if they were livestock. That boy was Elias. His mother held his hand tightly, whispering calm words, even while fear trembled beneath her voice. That day changed everything in his life. Families were separated. Promises were broken, and the boy learned how cruel power could be when it answered to no conscience. Yet Elias also noticed something else during those long hours at the auction yard. The wealthy men who believed they controlled everything often underestimated the people standing quietly before them. They believed silence meant weakness. Years passed. Elias grew older, learning skills wherever he could. He listened to teachers, craftsmen, travelers, and scholars who crossed his path. Knowledge became his weapon, patience his shield. While powerful men built their empires with force, Elias studied human nature. He learned how pride could blind a man. He learned how loneliness could open doors no key could unlock. By the time he walked into Louisiana plantation country during the year 1858, Elias Mercer carried more than a toolbox filled with delicate instruments. He carried memories, questions, and a plan that had taken years to form. The plantation masters saw only a quiet craftsman. Their wives saw a thoughtful stranger who listened with rare kindness. But beneath that calm surface, Elias Mercer was preparing something far more unusual. And before long, 13 powerful men would discover that revenge does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with patience, charm, and a smile that hides a carefully measured storm. By the early months of the year 1860, Elias Mercer had become a familiar figure along the winding plantation roads of Louisiana. Carriages often carried him from one estate to another, invited by masters who admired his skills with delicate instruments. Yet while they believed they were hiring a craftsman, Elias understood something far more important. Every visit allowed him deeper access into the private lives of the families who ruled the land around them. One evening, he arrived again at the Wickham plantation, where the large grandfather clock he had repaired months earlier continued to tick perfectly in the hallway. Harold Wickham greeted him with loud satisfaction, praising the repair in front of guests as proof that he hired only the best workers. The compliment meant nothing to Elias. Instead, his attention quietly moved toward Clara Wickham, who sat near the edge of the veranda, watching the sunset beyond the cotton fields. Clara had changed since their first meeting. The loneliness in her eyes had become more visible, as if the quiet conversations she shared with Elias during earlier visits had awakened thoughts she could no longer ignore. Plantation society required wives to behave with calm obedience, smiling during dinners while their husbands spoke loudly about profits and politics. Yet Clara had begun to ask herself a question she had never dared to speak aloud. Was this truly the life she had chosen? When Elias stepped onto the veranda, she greeted him with the small smile of someone relieved to see a familiar face. Their conversation began with polite topics: music, books, small details of travel. Yet beneath the surface, something more personal stirred between them. Elias listened with the patience that had become his greatest strength. Clara spoke about the silence that filled the large house whenever guests departed. She spoke about the strange emptiness of living in luxury without purpose. Elias said very little, but every word he chose was careful and precise, like a craftsman placing delicate gears into a clock. Across the parish, another plantation stood along the riverbank, owned by a man named Charles Davenport. His estate was known for grand parties, where powerful men gathered to drink and boast about the fortunes they believed would last forever. Davenport's wife, Margaret Davenport, moved through these gatherings like a shadow beside her husband. She was elegant and educated, yet her opinions rarely mattered in a world where men controlled every conversation. When Elias Mercer arrived to repair a complicated European music box in the Davenport house, Margaret watched him with quiet fascination. The music box had remained broken for years. Several traveling mechanics had attempted to fix it, but failed. Elias opened the intricate mechanism with careful hands, studying each tiny spring and gear, while the room filled with silent anticipation. Within an hour, the music box began playing again. A soft melody drifted through the parlor, delicate and haunting. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if the sound had carried her somewhere far away. When she opened them again, she looked at Elias not merely as a repairman, but as someone capable of restoring forgotten beauty. That evening, she asked him about the cities he had seen during his travels. Elias spoke about libraries in distant towns, about musicians who practiced for hours in quiet halls, about craftsmen who treated their work like art rather than labor. His stories were simple, yet they painted a world far beyond the cotton fields. Margaret listened carefully, her curiosity growing with every sentence. She had lived for years surrounded by wealth, yet suddenly she realized she knew very little about the wider world. Elias Mercer had opened a door in her mind that could never fully close again. As the months passed, Elias visited more plantations across the parish. Each estate revealed another wife who lived within invisible walls. Eleanor Brick spent her evenings reading alone in the library, while her husband drank with guests. Clara Wickham watched sunsets from the veranda, while Harold Wickham argued about business with neighboring landowners. Margaret Davenport attended lavish parties, where her presence was admired but her voice ignored. Elias never rushed anything. His plan depended entirely on patience. Instead of dramatic gestures, he offered small acts of attention, remembering details from earlier conversations, asking thoughtful questions about books they enjoyed, about music they once played as children, about dreams they had quietly abandoned after marriage. These conversations did not appear dangerous to anyone watching from the outside. Yet slowly they created bonds that felt surprisingly powerful. One afternoon, Eleanor Brick asked Elias a question that revealed just how deeply his influence had begun to grow. She asked him whether he believed people could truly change their lives if they found the courage to act. Elias paused before answering. His reply was calm but meaningful. He said that sometimes the greatest prisons were built not from iron, but from expectations. Once a person realized those walls were invisible, they could begin searching for a door. The idea lingered in Eleanor's mind long after Elias left the plantation that day. She walked through the halls of the brick house, noticing every detail differently. The portraits on the walls no longer looked proud. They looked like reminders of a rigid tradition she had never chosen. For the first time in years, she wondered whether her life might hold possibilities beyond obedience to a cruel husband. Meanwhile, the plantation masters remained completely unaware of the quiet transformation unfolding within their own homes. They continued inviting Elias Mercer to repair instruments, praising his skills and recommending him to neighboring estates. The irony was almost unbelievable. By trusting him with access to their private rooms and parlors, they unknowingly helped him strengthen the connections he was building with their wives. At social gatherings, Elias observed how the masters behaved. Pride filled every conversation. They competed over land, profits, and influence while speaking about people around them as if they were possessions. None of them noticed the thoughtful glances exchanged between their wives and the quiet craftsman standing near the corner of the room. Elias knew that revenge built on anger alone often collapsed too quickly. Real transformation required something more careful. He did not want to destroy these men through violence. Instead, he wanted them to face a consequence they had never imagined possible. The very people they believed they controlled would become the reason their power unraveled. Late one night, Elias sat alone in a small rented room above a general store in town. A candle flickered beside the tools spread across his table. Yet he was not studying instruments. He was studying letters. Carefully folded papers written by several plantation wives rested in front of him. Each letter spoke about loneliness, frustration, and curiosity about a different life. Elias read them slowly, understanding that the next steps of his plan were beginning to take shape. The year 1861 arrived with tensions spreading across the nation. Political arguments about slavery and power grew louder every month. Plantation masters worried about conflicts that might threaten their fortunes. Yet inside their own homes, another conflict was quietly forming, one they could not yet see. Clara Wickham wrote to Elias, describing how she dreamed of traveling north to study music. Margaret Davenport asked him about schools where women could learn literature and languages. Eleanor Brick wrote about her fear of living forever under the cruelty of her husband. Each letter revealed something deeper than simple admiration. These women were beginning to imagine lives beyond the plantations. Elias responded carefully to each message. He never made promises he could not keep. Instead, he encouraged their curiosity. He described towns where women worked as teachers, musicians, and writers. He explained that knowledge and independence could grow slowly if someone found the courage to pursue them. Every letter he sent planted another seed of possibility. By the end of that year, the number of women writing to Elias Mercer had grown far beyond 3. Several plantation wives now shared similar thoughts, though none of them realized how many others felt the same way. Elias knew exactly how many. 13 letters rested in the wooden box beside his tools. 13 voices questioning the lives they had been forced to accept. The plan Elias Mercer had carried for years was finally approaching its most delicate stage. The plantation masters believed they ruled their households completely. Yet the quiet craftsman they had welcomed into their homes was about to prove something extraordinary. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is not destruction. Sometimes it is awakening. And when 13 women awaken at the same time, even the strongest empires can begin to tremble. By the spring of the year 1861, Elias Mercer had become something far more significant than a traveling repairman. In the quiet corners of plantation houses across the parish, he had become a confidant, a listener, and for some women, the first person who had ever taken their thoughts seriously. Yet even those women who trusted him deeply still did not understand the full shape of the plan unfolding around them. The letters continued arriving, carefully delivered through servants or hidden within small packages sent to the general store in town. Each one carried the voice of a woman questioning the life she had been given. Clara Wickham wrote about the constant arguments she overheard between plantation owners discussing profits and politics, as if human lives were merely numbers on paper. Margaret Davenport wrote about her frustration at watching brilliant conversations about literature and science remain forever outside her reach. Eleanor Brick wrote with a mixture of fear and determination, describing how the cruelty of her husband had finally become unbearable. Elias read every letter slowly, sometimes more than once. He understood the emotional weight carried by each sentence. Yet he also knew something the women themselves did not yet realize. Their stories were not isolated. Across the parish, 13 different wives were experiencing the same awakening. Each believed she was alone in her doubts. Elias Mercer knew otherwise. Late one evening, he lit a lantern and spread the letters across the table in his small rented room. The flickering light illuminated 13 separate signatures. 13 lives connected by loneliness, intelligence, and the quiet realization that their world could change if they dared to imagine something beyond it. Elias studied the letters carefully, then began writing replies that would slowly guide them toward a future none of their husbands would ever expect. Clara Wickham was the first to notice that Elias Mercer's letters had begun to change. They were still thoughtful and gentle, yet now they carried subtle suggestions. He spoke about the importance of education and independence. He mentioned towns where women had created schools and small businesses. He described libraries where curious minds gathered to share ideas freely. At first, Clara simply read the letters with fascination, but soon the ideas began influencing her daily life. She reopened the piano in the parlor and began practicing again. After years of silence, music filled the Wickham house during quiet afternoons while her husband rode through the fields inspecting crops. Servants passing through the hallway paused to listen, surprised by the energy that had returned to their mistress. One evening, Harold Wickham entered the parlor while Clara was playing a complex piece she had recently rediscovered. He stared at her with mild confusion. For years, she had rarely touched the instrument. Now the sound of confident music echoed through the room. When he asked what had inspired her sudden interest, Clara answered simply that she had been reminded how much she once loved it. Wickham shrugged and poured himself a drink. Music meant little to him compared to cotton prices and political debates. Yet he failed to notice the deeper truth unfolding in front of him. Clara Wickham was beginning to rediscover parts of herself that plantation life had forced into silence, and Elias Mercer had been the one to remind her those parts still existed. Across the parish, Margaret Davenport experienced a similar transformation. After years of attending her husband's grand social gatherings, without participating in meaningful conversation, she began hosting small afternoon meetings of her own. At first, the gatherings appeared harmless. Several plantation wives met in the Davenport parlor to discuss books and music. Charles Davenport laughed when he heard about these meetings. In his mind, they were nothing more than idle entertainment for women with too much free time. He proudly told his friends that his wife had started a reading circle. The other plantation masters chuckled and returned to discussing business deals. None of them suspected that these gatherings would soon become something far more powerful than casual conversation. During the meetings, Margaret shared ideas she had discussed in letters with Elias Mercer. She spoke about education for women, about travel, about opportunities beyond plantation society. At first, the other wives listened politely, unsure how seriously to take such thoughts. Yet curiosity spread quickly. Each woman realized that her private frustrations were shared by others in the room. Within weeks, the reading circle grew larger. Eleanor Brick began attending despite her husband's disapproval of any activity he did not control. Several other wives joined as well. The parlor that once hosted silent dinners now echoed with lively discussions about literature, philosophy, and the changing political climate of the nation. Without realizing it, the women had begun forming a quiet alliance. Elias Mercer watched these developments carefully from a distance. He continued visiting plantations to repair instruments and clocks, maintaining the appearance of a simple craftsman. Yet every visit allowed him to observe the subtle changes unfolding inside the households of powerful men. The wives spoke with greater confidence. Their conversations carried new energy. Some began asking questions during dinners that surprised their husbands. Others spent more time reading or practicing music, instead of quietly observing plantation routines. The masters noticed the changes, but misunderstood their cause. Several blamed the growing political tensions spreading across the country. The year 1861 had already brought talk of war between northern and southern states. Plantation owners worried about economic uncertainty. In their minds, the unusual behavior of their wives was simply a result of nervous times. Elias understood the deeper truth. Awareness had begun spreading like a quiet flame. Once a person realized that life could be different, it became impossible to return completely to ignorance. The plantation wives had glimpsed possibilities beyond the narrow roles assigned to them. Soon those possibilities would demand action. By late summer, Elias Mercer knew the moment for the next stage of his plan had arrived. 13 women now participated in the reading gatherings at the Davenport plantation. Each one had written letters describing her growing determination to change her future. Yet none of them knew the full extent of the movement forming around them. One afternoon, Elias requested a private meeting with Margaret Davenport in the garden behind her house. The flowers were in full bloom, and the scent of jasmine drifted through the warm air as they spoke. Margaret listened carefully while Elias explained an idea that would reshape everything. He told her that the reading circle had already proven something remarkable. Women who had lived in isolation within their plantations had discovered strength through shared knowledge. If they truly wished to pursue education and independence, they would need a place where those goals could grow openly. Margaret's eyes widened as she realized what he was suggesting. A school, a place where women could study literature, music, and languages without the restrictions of plantation society. The idea felt almost impossible, yet at the same time, it felt thrillingly real. Elias explained that northern cities already supported such institutions. If the 13 women truly wished to change their lives, they could travel together and begin a new chapter beyond the cotton fields. The plan would require courage and careful timing. Their husbands would never approve. Margaret stood silently among the flowers, her heart racing as the reality settled in. For years, she had lived inside a world that felt permanent and unchangeable. Now a door stood open in front of her, and beyond that door waited a future she had never dared to imagine. Elias Mercer watched her expression carefully. The moment he had spent years preparing was finally approaching. 13 powerful plantation masters believed their households were under complete control. Soon they would discover something astonishing. The wives they had underestimated were about to make a decision that would shake the entire parish. And the quiet craftsman, who had entered their homes as a harmless visitor, would become the unseen architect of a rebellion no one had expected. The idea of leaving the plantations did not spread quickly at first. Even after Margaret Davenport heard Elias Mercer explain the possibility of building a new life through education, the thought felt almost too large to grasp. Plantation society had taught these women since childhood that their lives followed a single path: marriage, obedience, and silent support of their husband's authority formed the invisible structure of their world. Yet once the idea existed, it refused to disappear. During the next reading gathering at the Davenport house, Margaret carefully introduced the topic. She did not mention Elias by name. Instead, she asked a question that lingered in the air long after she spoke it. What if women had the opportunity to study freely in another place, away from plantation expectations? The room grew quiet. Eleanor Brick was the first to respond. She spoke slowly, choosing her words with caution. Yet the determination in her voice was unmistakable. She admitted that she had dreamed of escaping the cruelty of her husband for years, but had never believed it possible. Several other women exchanged uneasy glances, each recognizing pieces of her own hidden thoughts within Eleanor's confession. Clara Wickham then added something that changed the tone of the conversation completely. She explained that music had once been her greatest passion, but marriage in plantation society had slowly erased that part of her life. She said that sometimes she imagined performing in a concert hall somewhere far away, where no one expected her to sit quietly beside a husband who cared nothing for art. The room filled with a strange mixture of excitement and fear as more voices joined the discussion. While the women debated possibilities inside the Davenport parlor, the plantation masters gathered elsewhere in the parish to discuss political tensions spreading across the country. The year 1861 had brought the first rumblings of a conflict that would soon erupt into the American Civil War. Many Southern landowners believed the war would protect their way of life. Others worried about the economic uncertainty it might create. Harold Wickham sat among several plantation owners during one of these gatherings. Their conversation revolved around cotton prices, trade routes, and the loyalty of neighboring states. None of them spoke about their wives or the subtle changes happening within their homes. Those matters seemed insignificant compared to the looming political storm. Nathaniel Brick dismissed concerns about the future with arrogant confidence. He insisted that the plantation system had existed too long to collapse now. According to him, powerful men controlled the economy and therefore controlled the outcome of any conflict. The others nodded in agreement, comforted by the familiar language of dominance and certainty. If any of them had walked into the Davenport parlor that same afternoon, they would have witnessed a far more immediate challenge to their authority. 13 women were quietly discussing whether they should leave the plantations entirely. The masters believed their greatest threats came from distant political debates. They could not imagine that the real transformation was beginning inside their own households. Over the following weeks, the conversations among the women became more serious. The reading circle transformed into something closer to a council. Each meeting explored practical questions about travel, money, and safety. Some of the women hesitated, frightened by the consequences their husbands might impose if they discovered the plan. Eleanor Brick, however, surprised everyone with her courage. She admitted that remaining on the plantation carried its own danger. Her husband's violent temper had grown worse in recent years. For her, the risk of leaving suddenly seemed less terrifying than the certainty of staying. Clara Wickham offered another perspective. She explained that wealth controlled by plantation masters could easily become a trap. The luxurious houses and elegant clothing often disguised the reality that wives possessed very little legal independence. If they wished to pursue education or careers, they would need to leave the system that restricted them. Margaret Davenport listened carefully to every voice in the room. Eventually, she revealed the full idea Elias Mercer had shared with her in the garden. A small school in the north could welcome them, allowing them to study literature, music, and languages. The journey would not be simple, especially during a time of national conflict. Yet it represented a genuine path toward independence. Elias Mercer continued his visits to plantations, while the women debated their future. Each time he entered one of the large houses, he felt the tension beneath the surface growing stronger. The wives greeted him with polite calm when others were present, yet brief private conversations revealed their increasing determination. One afternoon, Eleanor Brick stopped him near the library doorway. Her voice remained quiet, but the intensity in her eyes was unmistakable. She told him that the women had nearly reached a decision. Fear still lingered among them, yet the possibility of freedom had become too powerful to ignore. Elias listened without interrupting, understanding that the choice had to belong entirely to them. His role was not to command their actions, but to reveal possibilities they had never been allowed to consider. The final step required courage that only they could summon. Later that evening, Elias walked through the small town near the parish, reflecting on the years that had brought him to this moment. His plan had never been about simple revenge against plantation masters. It had been about something deeper. These powerful men believed they controlled every life within their estates. By helping their wives discover independence, Elias was proving that authority built on oppression could collapse from within. The decisive meeting occurred during a stormy evening late in the summer of 1861. Rain fell steadily against the windows of the Davenport house as the 13 women gathered once again in the parlor. Thunder rolled across the sky while candles flickered on the table beside stacks of books. Margaret Davenport stood near the center of the room and spoke with calm determination. She explained that every person eventually reaches a moment when hesitation becomes more dangerous than action. The plantation system had defined their lives for years, yet the nation itself was beginning to fracture under the weight of that same system. Clara Wickham added that the approaching war would likely change the country forever. If the future was uncertain, perhaps that uncertainty offered a chance to create new lives rather than remain trapped in old ones. Eleanor Brick nodded firmly, declaring that she had already decided to leave regardless of the consequences. One by one, the other women shared their thoughts. Some spoke with trembling voices, others with surprising confidence. Yet every statement carried the same underlying realization. Their lives could no longer continue as before. The reading circle that had once discussed novels and music had evolved into something revolutionary. When the final vote was taken, all 13 women agreed they would leave the plantations together and travel north to begin their education. The decision felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Outside, the storm continued to roar, but inside the parlor, a different kind of storm had just begun. None of the plantation masters, sleeping comfortably in their large houses, realized what had been decided that night. Within weeks, their wives would vanish from the world they believed was permanent. And when the truth finally reached them, they would face a humiliation unlike anything their pride had ever prepared them to endure. The quiet craftsmen they had welcomed into their homes had just helped ignite the most unexpected rebellion in the history of their parish. The decision made during that stormy night did not bring immediate action. Instead, it introduced a quiet tension that followed each of the 13 women back to their plantations. Every hallway, every dinner table conversation, every polite smile exchanged with their husbands now carried hidden meaning. They were preparing to leave a world that believed it owned them. Clara Wickham felt the weight of that secret more strongly than she expected. During the following days, she moved through the large Wickham house, performing the same routines she had followed for years, supervising meals, greeting guests, and playing the role of a beautiful plantation wife. Yet beneath the calm surface, her mind raced with plans. Late in the evening, she packed small items into a traveling trunk hidden inside a storage room near the back of the house. Books she loved, sheet music she had played during childhood, letters from friends who had long ago moved north. Each object represented a fragment of the life she hoped to reclaim. Harold Wickham noticed none of it. Like many plantation masters, he remained absorbed in discussions about politics and the growing war between the northern and southern states. Newspapers filled with alarming headlines lay scattered across his desk. He believed the greatest challenge facing him involved protecting cotton profits and maintaining authority over his land. The possibility that his own wife might be preparing to leave him never entered his mind. Margaret Davenport faced a more complicated challenge. Her house had become the center of the reading circle, which meant servants and visitors often noticed the gatherings taking place in her parlor. To avoid suspicion, she gradually reduced the number of meetings, while quietly communicating with the other women through letters and brief visits. The plan required careful coordination. Traveling during wartime carried risks, especially for groups of women leaving southern plantations without their husbands. Elias Mercer helped arrange the details through contacts he had made during years of travel. He located a safe route leading toward cities where the women could continue their education. One afternoon, Margaret met Elias in the garden once again, the same place where the idea of leaving had first been spoken aloud. She listened closely while he described the journey. The women would travel in small groups, rather than all at once, avoiding attention along the roads. A trusted carriage driver would escort them north toward a town where friends of Elias had promised assistance. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and dread as she heard the details. Once the first woman left her plantation, there would be no turning back. The decision made during the stormy night would become reality. Elias watched her expression carefully and reminded her that courage often appears only when action becomes unavoidable. Eleanor Brick prepared for departure with fierce determination. Unlike some of the others, she had no desire to preserve the illusion of harmony inside her marriage. Years of cruelty had erased any remaining attachment she felt toward the plantation house. Nathaniel Brick spent most evenings drinking heavily with neighboring landowners, complaining about political developments he could not control. While he shouted about loyalty to the Southern cause, Eleanor quietly arranged her own escape within the same walls. She gathered money that had been secretly given to her as gifts from relatives long ago. She hid the coins beneath folded clothing inside a travel bag. The act felt strangely empowering. For the first time since her marriage, she was making decisions entirely for herself. One night, she walked through the silent halls of the brick mansion, pausing beneath the large portraits of her husband's ancestors. Their painted faces stared down with the same cold pride she had seen since the day she arrived at the plantation. Eleanor looked at them calmly and whispered a single sentence that would have shocked anyone who heard it. She told them their legacy of control would end without her. Meanwhile, Elias Mercer continued moving between plantations as if nothing unusual were happening. He repaired clocks, tuned pianos, and fixed delicate locks exactly as he had done since arriving in Louisiana. The plantation masters welcomed him with the same careless trust they had always shown. Harold Wickham even joked one evening that Elias understood the inner workings of machines better than most people understood their own households. The comment amused everyone at the table. None of them realized how strangely accurate the statement truly was. Elias listened to their laughter with quiet patience. These men believed their authority over wives, land, and labor formed an unbreakable system. They had never considered that emotional neglect and arrogance might slowly weaken the very foundations of that system. Later that night, Elias returned to his small rented room above the general store. The wooden box containing 13 letters still rested beside his tools. He opened it carefully and read several of the messages again. Each one carried hope, fear, and determination. He knew that the moment of departure was approaching quickly. Once the first carriage left the parish, carrying one of those women toward a new life, the chain reaction would begin. 13 powerful plantation masters would soon discover that the people they believed they controlled had quietly chosen a different future. The first departure occurred during a calm morning in early autumn of the year 1861. The sun had barely risen above the fields when Clara Wickham stepped into the carriage waiting behind a grove of trees near the edge of the plantation. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared someone inside the house might hear it. She carried only a small trunk and a bag containing her sheet music and letters. The carriage driver nodded respectfully as she climbed inside. Within moments, the wheels began moving along the narrow road leading away from the plantation. Clara watched the white columns of the Wickham mansion slowly disappear behind the trees. For years, that house had represented security mixed with quiet despair. Now it became a distant memory fading into the morning light. Later that same day, Harold Wickham returned from inspecting the cotton fields, expecting the usual quiet routine of plantation life. Instead, he found servants whispering nervously in rooms strangely empty. Clara Wickham was gone. At first, he believed she had traveled to visit relatives without informing him. Yet as hours passed and no explanation arrived, confusion slowly turned into alarm. Meanwhile, across the parish, something similar was beginning to happen inside other plantation houses. Eleanor Brick left before dawn the following morning. Margaret Davenport prepared to depart 2 days later. One by one, the wives of powerful plantation masters began vanishing from their homes. Within a single week, 13 women would disappear from plantation society entirely. The men who had built their reputations on control and authority would face an embarrassment unlike anything they had ever experienced. And at the center of it all stood Elias Mercer, the quiet craftsman whose calm smile had hidden a plan years in the making. The revenge he had chosen was not violence nor destruction. It was far more unsettling than that. He had simply helped 13 women realize they no longer belonged to the men who believed they owned them. By the middle of autumn in the year 1861, the quiet plantation roads of the parish buzzed with confusion and anger. Servants whispered among themselves, neighbors exchanged stunned rumors, and several plantation masters rode from house to house searching for answers. Within only a few days, 13 wives had vanished from their homes. Harold Wickham was among the first to realize the situation was not a coincidence. At first, he believed Clara had simply traveled without informing him. But when he visited Charles Davenport and discovered Margaret Davenport had also disappeared, his irritation turned into alarm. The shock deepened when news arrived that Eleanor Brick and several other plantation wives had vanished as well. The realization struck like thunder across the parish. These women had not left separately by accident. Something connected their departures. Plantation masters gathered angrily to discuss what had happened. Their pride had been wounded in a way none of them had ever imagined possible. Nathaniel Brick shouted accusations at anyone who would listen. He insisted that some unknown agitator must have influenced the women, perhaps Northern abolitionists spreading dangerous ideas. His voice echoed through the meeting hall, while the other men struggled to understand how 13 households could collapse into scandal at the same moment. Yet none of them could produce a clear explanation. The only thing they agreed upon was that someone must have encouraged their wives to abandon the plantations, and whoever that person was had humiliated some of the most powerful men in the region. While the plantation masters argued among themselves, the women traveled steadily northward. They moved carefully along routes Elias Mercer had arranged through trusted contacts. Small towns along the way provided temporary shelter, where the travelers could rest before continuing the journey. The road was not easy. News of the growing civil war had already begun to disrupt transportation across the country. Military patrols occasionally stopped travelers to ask questions. Yet traveling in small groups helped the women avoid suspicion. They appeared simply as families relocating away from the southern conflict. Clara Wickham felt the weight of uncertainty during the early days of the journey. Each mile carried her farther from the life she had always known. Yet with every passing day, she also felt something new growing inside her. Freedom. It was unfamiliar and sometimes frightening, but it also felt powerful. Margaret Davenport spent long hours discussing books, and ideas with the other women inside the carriage. Their reading circle had once been limited to a quiet parlor on the plantation. Now the entire world seemed open for conversation. They spoke about literature, music, politics, and the future of a country entering one of the most turbulent periods in its history. Eleanor Brick remained the most determined among them. For her, the journey represented escape from a prison she had endured for years. She often looked out across the changing landscape with calm satisfaction. Each mile north felt like a step away from fear. Back in the parish, suspicion slowly began pointing toward a familiar figure. Several plantation masters eventually remembered something that now seemed impossible to ignore. Nearly all of their wives had spoken at some point about a traveling craftsman who repaired instruments and clocks. Harold Wickham was the first to speak Elias Mercer's name aloud during one of the tense gatherings among the plantation owners. At first, the others dismissed the idea. Elias had always appeared polite, quiet, and harmless. He was simply a repairman who visited their houses occasionally. But the more they discussed it, the more the pieces began to connect. Many of their wives had first mentioned him around the same period. Some had spoken about interesting conversations with him regarding music or literature. Others had asked unusual questions about travel or education after his visits. Nathaniel Brick slammed his fist against the table when the realization finally reached him. He shouted that the quiet craftsman must have manipulated the women with false promises. In his mind, Elias Mercer had not simply encouraged their wives to leave, he had stolen them. Anger spread rapidly through the group of plantation masters. Pride turned humiliation into fury. These men had built their reputations on control and authority. The idea that a single outsider could influence their households was unbearable. Yet, despite their anger, they faced a frustrating truth. Elias Mercer had disappeared as well. By the time suspicion focused on him, Elias was already miles away from the parish. He traveled quietly along the same northern route as the women, though he kept his distance to avoid drawing attention. His role in their journey had always been that of a guide rather than a leader. One evening, he arrived at a small town where several of the women were scheduled to stop for the night. Clara Wickham, Margaret Davenport, and Eleanor Brick greeted him with visible relief. Seeing him again reminded them that the daring plan they had followed was part of something larger than their individual decisions. They gathered inside a modest boarding house dining room to discuss the next stage of their journey. Elias explained that the remaining distance to their destination would take several more days. Beyond the next state line, they would reach a town where a progressive school had agreed to welcome them. For a moment, the room filled with silence as the women absorbed the reality of what awaited them. Education, independence, and the chance to build lives defined by their own choices, rather than plantation expectations. Clara finally spoke the question that lingered in everyone's mind. She asked Elias why he had devoted so much effort to helping them escape a system that had trapped them for years. His answer was calm but deeply personal. Elias Mercer told them about the boy he once was, standing beside his mother outside the auction yard many years earlier. He described the fear he felt watching families separated by wealthy men who believed their power could never be challenged. That memory had shaped his understanding of injustice long before he arrived in Louisiana. He explained that revenge had once seemed like the only answer. As a young man, he had imagined confronting plantation masters directly. But as he grew older, he realized violence often created more suffering without truly changing the system that caused it. Instead, he chose a different path. Plantation society depended on obedience and silence within households. If the wives of powerful men discovered their own independence, the illusion of total control would begin to crack. Helping the 13 women awaken to their own potential was not simply revenge. It was proof that authority built on arrogance could collapse in unexpected ways. The plantation masters believed they ruled everything within their estates. Yet the most personal part of their lives had slipped beyond their control. The women listened quietly as Elias finished speaking. None of them had fully understood the deeper purpose behind the plan until that moment. They had been searching for freedom from loneliness and neglect. Elias had been demonstrating something even larger. Together, they had exposed the fragile foundation beneath a system that claimed absolute power. And as their journey toward a new future continued, the men who once believed themselves untouchable were left behind in a parish filled with embarrassment and unanswered questions. Only one more chapter remained before the strange revenge of Elias Mercer would reach its final and unforgettable conclusion. By early winter of the year 1861, the long journey finally brought the 13 women and Elias Mercer to a northern town where the air felt colder, but the atmosphere strangely hopeful. The town stood beside a river lined with brick buildings, schools, and small music halls. Unlike the plantation estates they had left behind, this place buzzed with people pursuing trade, study, and ideas. When the carriages rolled into the town square, the women looked around with quiet amazement. No vast cotton fields surrounded the streets. No large houses controlled by a single powerful master dominated the landscape. Instead, there were shops, classrooms, libraries, and bustling markets where people moved freely through their daily lives. The school Elias had mentioned stood near the edge of town, a modest but welcoming building with tall windows and a small courtyard. The headmistress, a thoughtful woman named Abigail Carter, greeted the travelers with calm warmth. She had received Elias Mercer's letters weeks earlier, explaining the unusual group who wished to study there. Abigail listened carefully as the women described their situation. Instead of shock or judgment, she offered something they had rarely received in their former lives: respect. She told them the school existed precisely for people who wanted to expand their minds and pursue knowledge regardless of where they came from. For the first time since leaving the plantations, the 13 women felt the true weight of their decision settle into something solid. Their daring journey had not ended in uncertainty. It had brought them to a place where their curiosity and intelligence were welcomed rather than ignored. The first weeks at the school felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. Many of the women had not studied seriously since childhood, yet their determination pushed them forward. Days filled with lessons in literature, history, languages, and music. Clara Wickham spent long hours practicing piano in the music hall. The instrument echoed through the corridors with energy she had not felt in years. Other students often gathered quietly near the door to listen. Some whispered that her playing carried a deep emotional strength shaped by the life she had left behind. Margaret Davenport immersed herself in literature and philosophy. Books that had once been distant curiosities became subjects of passionate discussion in classrooms. For the first time, she spoke openly in debates, sharing ideas without fear of being dismissed by a husband who believed women's opinions held no value. Eleanor Brick discovered something unexpected about herself. She possessed a remarkable talent for teaching. During study sessions, she often helped younger students understand difficult passages from history texts. Abigail Carter noticed her ability and soon invited her to assist with beginner classes. The 13 women who once lived isolated inside plantation mansions now walked freely through classrooms filled with conversation and learning. Their transformation amazed even themselves. Far to the south, however, the scandal continued to echo through plantation society. The disappearance of 13 wives had become a story repeated across neighboring counties. Some people treated it like gossip. Others viewed it as a troubling sign of social change. The plantation masters attempted to restore their reputations by presenting themselves as victims of manipulation. Nathaniel Brick loudly claimed that a cunning outsider had deceived the women with false promises of opportunity. Harold Wickham insisted that northern influences had corrupted southern households. Yet their explanations did little to calm the embarrassment that followed them everywhere. Friends whispered behind their backs. Servants exchanged knowing glances. The authority these men once displayed so confidently now carried an unmistakable crack. Most frustrating of all was the fact that they could not find Elias Mercer. The quiet craftsman who had once walked freely through their homes seemed to have vanished from the entire region. Some believed he had fled north. Others claimed he had joined abolitionist groups opposing the plantation system. The truth remained unclear, but the result of his actions could not be ignored. 13 powerful plantation masters had lost something they believed could never leave them's control. During the spring of the year 1862, nearly a year after the first quiet reading gatherings in the Davenport parlor, the school organized a public event celebrating music and literature. Students and townspeople filled the hall to hear performances and speeches from those who had made remarkable progress in their studies. Clara Wickham stepped onto the stage to perform a complex piano piece she had practiced for months. The audience listened in respectful silence as her fingers moved across the keys with graceful confidence. When the final notes faded, applause filled the hall. Margaret Davenport delivered a thoughtful speech about the power of education to transform lives. She spoke about curiosity, courage, and the importance of questioning traditions that limit human potential. Many listeners later said her words carried a quiet strength that made them reconsider their own assumptions about society. Eleanor Brick stood beside Abigail Carter to help present certificates to several younger students she had been teaching. Watching the proud smiles of those children reminded her how different her life had become. At the back of the hall, Elias Mercer stood quietly among the crowd. He did not seek recognition or applause. His calm expression revealed quiet satisfaction as he watched the women build the new lives they had once believed impossible. Months later, Elias Mercer prepared to leave the town and continue traveling once again. His work there was finished. The 13 women no longer needed guidance. They had discovered their own strength and direction. Before departing, he met them one final time in the school courtyard. Spring flowers filled the garden with color as they spoke about the strange path that had brought them together. Clara thanked him for reminding her that passion for music did not disappear simply because society ignored it. Margaret thanked him for encouraging ideas she had once been afraid to voice. Eleanor thanked him for giving her the courage to step away from a life defined by fear. Elias listened quietly before offering a final reflection. He explained that history often celebrates loud revolutions and dramatic battles. Yet sometimes the most powerful changes begin with quiet conversations that awaken people to their own possibilities. The plantation masters who had ruled their estates believed they possessed absolute authority over the lives around them. But their greatest weakness had been arrogance. They never imagined that respect, curiosity, and simple human kindness could inspire a rebellion far more effective than violence. As Elias Mercer walked away from the courtyard that afternoon, the 13 women watched with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. His revenge against the plantation system had been strange, subtle, and brilliant. He had not burned plantations or confronted powerful men with weapons. Instead, he had done something far more unsettling. He had shown the wives of 13 masters that their lives belonged to themselves. And once that truth awakened, no amount of wealth or authority could ever force it back into silence. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story fascinated you, remember to subscribe to the channel and like the video so more hidden stories from history can reach curious minds like yours. Until the next story, stay curious and keep exploring the shadows of history.